The town of Greenfield was not a place found on most maps. Tucked away in the endless plains of the American Midwest, it was a small, isolated farming town where everyone knew each other's name and their secrets. The land stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with barns, fields of golden wheat, and the occasional windmill creaking in the breeze. It was a place where life moved slowly, but beneath the surface, old grudges simmered like an unchecked fire. The Harrisons and the Clarks were the two oldest families in Greenfield. Their names were etched into the town's history, their legacies entwined with the very soil they tilled. But what was once a simple dispute over a piece of land had grown into a bitter feud, passed down through generations like a cursed inheritance. No one quite remembered how it all began. Some said it started over a boundary line that wasn't properly marked. Others whispered about a betrayal long forgotten. But the details no longer mattered. What mattered was the hatred that festered between the two families, a hatred that had claimed more than just land. It had claimed lives. Ethan Harrison was in his early 20s, with the kind of strength that came from working the land every day of his life. His hands were rough, his skin tanned by the sun, and his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to reflect the wide-open skies above. He had the look of someone who belonged to the earth, but his heart was not at peace. For as long as he could remember, Ethan had heard the stories, the tales of betrayal, of blood spilled in the name of honor, of the Harrison men who had gone before him and the duty they had carried. But unlike his father, John, who wore the family's legacy like armor, Ethan felt the weight of it like a chain around his neck. The latest chapter in the feud had been written just a few weeks earlier, when Ethan's older brother Daniel was killed in a clash with the Clarks. It was supposed to be a simple encounter, a warning, nothing more. But tempers flared, and before anyone could stop it, Daniel lay dead in the dirt. The news had spread through Greenfield like wildfire, and the town braced itself for what would come next. Ethan had been there when they brought Daniel's body home, his father's face a mask of stone, his mother's wails echoing through the farmhouse. He had watched as they buried Daniel next to the other Harrison men, his gravestone freshly carved, the earth still loose over his coffin. That day, standing at his brother's grave, Ethan felt something inside him break. It wasn't just the loss of his brother, it was the realization that this feud would never end unless someone stopped it. But who could stop it? Not his father, who was already planning the next move. Not the Clarks, who were surely preparing for retaliation. The thought gnawed at Ethan's mind, even as the pressure from his family mounted. "Ethan," his father had said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, the room filled with the smell of freshly baked bread. "You know what needs to be done." John Harrison was a man of few words, but each one carried the weight of a lifetime. His hands, calloused and strong, rested on the table, fingers drumming a slow, steady beat. His eyes, so similar to Ethan's, bore into his son with a mixture of expectation and unspoken grief. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He knew what was expected of him. As the eldest remaining son, it was now his duty to avenge Daniel's death, to prove that the Harrisons would not be cowed by the Clarks. But the thought of it made his stomach churn. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He'd been in plenty of scuffles before. But this was different. This was about ending a life, about carrying forward a feud that had already claimed too much. His mother, Mary, quietly cleared the dishes from the table, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't spoken much since Daniel's death, her grief manifesting in silent tears and sleepless nights. But Ethan knew she was hurting, perhaps more than anyone else. As she passed by, she placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, a silent plea in her eyes. She didn't want to lose another son, but she also knew the burden that Ethan carried. It was a cruel dilemma, one that no mother should have to face. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "there's no shame in wanting peace." Ethan looked up at her, surprised. His father said nothing, but the tension in the room was palpable. John Harrison might not have approved of his wife's words, but he didn't contradict her either. The Harrison family was not one to speak openly of emotions, but the pain in that room was almost suffocating. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, he thought about what his mother had said. Peace. It seemed like a foreign concept in Greenfield, a place where every slight was remembered and every wound left a scar. But was it really impossible? Could he, Ethan Harrison, be the one to end the cycle of violence that had plagued his family for so long? Or was he destined to follow in the footsteps of those who had come before him, to live and die by the code that had been drilled into him since birth? Ethan closed his eyes, trying to shut out the thoughts that swirled in his mind. Tomorrow he would be expected to make his move. The Clarks would be waiting, just as they had always been, and the whole town would be watching, ready to see who would strike the next blow. But as sleep finally took him, Ethan's heart was heavy with doubt, and a small, stubborn voice in the back of his mind whispered that there had to be another way. The dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it the weight of generations and the choice that would define Ethan's future. The morning sun cast long shadows over the Harrison farm, the light filtering through the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the property. The fields, which had been Ethan's sanctuary since childhood, now felt like a prison. Every corner of the land carried memories, some sweet and others bitter, but today it all seemed tinged with the weight of what was expected of him. Ethan walked slowly through the fields, his boots crunching on the dry soil. The air was thick with the scent of earth and the faint sweetness of the crops ripening under the sun. This land was everything to his family, the source of their livelihood and their pride. But it was also the root of their troubles, the battleground for a feud that had claimed so much. As Ethan approached the barn, he saw his father, John Harrison, already at work. The older man moved with a purposeful efficiency, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he repaired a section of the fence. John was a man of few words, but his presence was commanding. He had been the backbone of the Harrison family for as long as Ethan could remember, a figure of strength and unyielding resolve. "Morning, Dad," Ethan called out as he approached. John looked up, his expression stern but not unkind. "Morning, Ethan," he replied, his voice steady. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and motioned for Ethan to come closer. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then walked over to his father. The two men stood side by side, their gazes fixed on the horizon where the Clark farm lay just beyond the next ridge. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. "You know what needs to be done today," John said finally, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. "I know, Dad." John turned to face his son, his eyes searching Ethan's face for something, resolve perhaps, or the same fire that had burned in Daniel. But all he found was a young man torn between duty and doubt. "This feud," John began, his voice low and measured, "it's more than just about land. It's about who we are, what we stand for. The Harrisons don't back down. We don't let others walk over us." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. "I understand, but what?" John interrupted, his tone sharpening. "You think there's another way? You think the Clarks will just let this go? They killed your brother, Ethan. They'll do worse if we don't stand up to them." Ethan's jaw clenched as he struggled to find the right words. I don't want to see any more blood spilled." What if nothing?" John snapped, his voice rising with an intensity that startled Ethan. "This isn't about what you want, Ethan. It's about what needs to be done. Family comes first. Always." Ethan felt the sting of his father's words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be another way. He glanced down at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. "I know, Dad. Just what?" John demanded, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than the men who came before you? You think you can just walk away from this?" Ethan shook his head, frustration and guilt churning inside him. "No, I don't think I'm better. But maybe it's time we did something different." John stared at Ethan for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, the lines on his face deepening with the weight of years. "Ethan, I know this isn't easy, but the world we live in doesn't give us the luxury of choice. We do what we have to do because that's the way it is." Ethan nodded slowly, though his heart was far from convinced. "I'll do what's expected of me," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. John studied his son for a moment longer before turning back to his work. "Good. That's all I ask." Ethan stood there for a few moments, watching his father work, before turning and walking back toward the house. His mother Mary was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. The smell of yeast and flour filled the air, a comforting reminder of simpler times. Mary looked up as Ethan entered, her eyes softening when she saw the troubled expression on his face. "Ethan, sit down," she said gently, wiping her hands on her apron. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the worn wood. Mary joined him, her gaze filled with concern. "What's on your mind, son?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just all of this. The feud, the expectations. I don't know if I can do it, Mom." Mary reached out and took Ethan's hand in hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "I know it's hard, Ethan. I've watched this feud take so much from us, from everyone. But I also know that you have a good heart. You've always been different from your father, from Daniel." Ethan looked at his mother, surprised by her words. "You don't want this feud to continue, do you?" Mary shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, I don't. But I've felt powerless to stop it. Your father, he's a good man, but he's set in his ways. He believes in the old ways, in the honor of the family. But I see the toll it's taken on all of us." Ethan squeezed his mother's hand, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "What if there's another way, Mom? What if we could find a way to end this without more bloodshed?" Mary smiled sadly, her expression bittersweet. "I wish there was, Ethan. But it's not just up to us. The Clarks, they've suffered too. They've lost just as much as we have. I don't know if they'd be willing to listen." Ethan nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "Maybe, but someone has to try, right?" Mary looked at her son with a mixture of pride and fear. "If anyone can do it, Ethan, it's you, but be careful. These things, they're not easily changed." Ethan stood up, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I'll be careful, Mom, but I have to try." Mary watched as Ethan left the kitchen, a silent prayer on her lips. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. As Ethan stepped outside, the afternoon sun warm on his face, he knew that his choice would not only define his future, but that of his family and the Clarks as well. Somewhere across the fields, Matthew Clark was likely preparing for the inevitable clash, just as Ethan was. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to break the cycle of violence that had bound their families for generations. The day was far from over, and the weight of tradition still pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. But as he looked out over the rolling hills that separated the Harrisons from the Clarks, he felt a spark of courage, a determination to find another path, a path that could lead them all beyond the horizon of their feud. The dusty road leading out of Greenfield wound through miles of open farmland, the endless fields of wheat swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan rode his old pickup truck down the road, the engine humming steadily beneath him. The truck's windows were rolled down, letting in the warm summer air, and for a brief moment Ethan allowed himself to forget about the feud, the expectations, and the heavy burden that weighed on his heart. Today he was headed to a nearby town, one of the few places where he could escape, if only for a little while. The town of Westwood was larger than Greenfield, though not by much. It had a few more shops, a busier main street, and a small diner that was always buzzing with the conversations of locals and travelers alike. Ethan didn't come here often, but when he did, it was a welcome break from the tension that clung to every corner of Greenfield. As he parked his truck near the general store, Ethan glanced around, taking in the familiar sights. The town was alive with the usual hustle and bustle, people going about their daily routines, children running through the streets, and the occasional horse-drawn cart clattering by. It was a place that felt both comforting and distant, a world apart from the one he was used to. Ethan stepped into the general store, the bell above the door jingling softly as he entered. The store was a small, cozy place, its wooden shelves lined with everything from canned goods to farming tools. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of old wood and leather. As Ethan gathered the supplies he needed, flour, sugar, a few tools for the farm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different today. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of possibility that he hadn't felt in a long time. Perhaps it was just being away from Greenfield, or perhaps it was something more. As he approached the counter to pay, Ethan noticed a young woman standing by the window, looking out at the street. She had long, chestnut brown hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple dress that swayed slightly with the movement of her body. There was something about her, something different from the people he knew. She seemed free. "Morning," Ethan said as he placed his items on the counter, trying to keep his voice casual. The woman turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with curiosity. She smiled warmly, a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Good morning," she replied, her voice soft and melodic. Ethan couldn't help but smile back. "You new in town?" he asked, noticing that she didn't have the look of a local. "Sort of," she said, stepping away from the window and approaching the counter. "I'm just passing through, really. I've been staying with some relatives for a few weeks, but I don't plan to stick around for long." Ethan nodded, intrigued. "Where are you headed?" She shrugged, her smile turning wistful. "Anywhere, really. I've been traveling for a while now, just trying to see as much of the world as I can. There's so much out there, you know. I don't want to be stuck in one place for the rest of my life." Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it envy? Longing? He had never met anyone like her before. Someone who seemed so unburdened by the expectations of others, so open to the possibilities of life. "That sounds amazing," he said, genuinely impressed. "I've never really been anywhere outside of Greenfield." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those bright green eyes. "Greenfield? That's not too far from here, right?" "Yeah, just a few miles down the road," Ethan replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Greenfield wasn't exactly the kind of place someone like her would find interesting. It was small, isolated, and bound by old traditions. "What's it like there?" she asked, genuinely curious. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to describe it. "It's quiet," he said finally. "Most people have been there their whole lives. It's a place where everyone knows everyone else. There's a lot of history, too. Some good, some not so good." She nodded as if she understood more than he was saying. "I'm Lila, by the way," she said, extending her hand. "Ethan," he replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm but gentle, her skin warm against his. "Nice to meet you, Ethan," Lila said, her smile returning. "You know, I was just about to head over to the diner for some lunch. Care to join me?" Ethan was caught off guard by the invitation, but something in Lila's easygoing manner made it hard to say no. "Sure," he said, surprising himself. "I'd like that." They walked out of the store together, the bell jingling softly behind them as they stepped onto the sunlit street. The diner was just a short walk away, a quaint little place with checkered tablecloths and a jukebox in the corner. The scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee wafted through the air as they entered, and Lila led them to a booth by the window. "So," Lila said as they settled into the booth, "tell me more about Greenfield. What's it like living there?" Ethan took a moment to gather his thoughts, not wanting to burden her with the heavy reality of the feud. "It's simple," he began. "People work hard, they take care of their land, and they look out for each other. But it's also a place where people hold on to the past. There's this feud between my family and another. It's been going on for generations." Lila's expression grew serious. "That sounds tough. Are you involved in it?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, my brother was killed not long ago because of it. Now everyone expects me to, carry on the fight." Lila's eyes softened with understanding. "That's a lot of pressure." "It is," Ethan admitted. "But meeting you, hearing about how you've been able to travel, to see the world, it's made me think. Maybe there's more to life than just carrying on a legacy of hate." Lila smiled gently, her hand resting on the table between them. "There's always more to life, Ethan. Sometimes it's just a matter of looking beyond what you've always known." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other. Lila told Ethan about her travels, about the places she'd seen, the people she'd met, and the adventures she'd had along the way. She spoke of her dreams, of the life she wanted to live, and the freedom she cherished. Ethan listened intently, captivated by her stories and inspired by her spirit. The more they talked, the more he felt a connection to her, a connection that went beyond simple attraction. Lila represented something he had never thought possible, a life free from the chains of the past, a life where he could be his own person, not just a Harrison bound by the expectations of others. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town, Ethan realized that he didn't want the day to end. But he also knew that he couldn't stay in Westwood forever. Eventually, he would have to return to Greenfield, to his family, and to the reality of the feud. But for now, as they walked back to the truck, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to break the cycle of violence that had defined his family for so long. And maybe Lila was the key to finding that path. As they reached the truck, Lila turned to him, her eyes bright in the fading light. "I'm glad we met today, Ethan," she said softly. "I think you have the strength to change things, if you want to." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I'm glad we met too, Lila. You've given me a lot to think about." She nodded, her smile widening. "Good. Just remember, no matter what happens, you have the power to choose your own path." Ethan watched as Lila walked away, her figure gradually disappearing into the twilight. He stood there for a moment, lost in thought, before finally getting into his truck. As he drove back to Greenfield, the road ahead seemed different. Less a path back to the past and more a road leading to something new. The glimmer of hope that had taken root in Ethan's heart grew stronger with each passing mile. The feud might still be there, waiting for him, but now he had something else to hold on to. A vision of a future that wasn't defined by violence and revenge, but by the possibility of peace and a life beyond the horizon. The sun hung low in the sky as Ethan's truck rumbled down the gravel path, leading back to the Harrison family farm. The golden light of dusk bathed the fields in a soft glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out infinitely, like the burdens weighing on Ethan's mind. The peaceful scenery stood in stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. The words of his father, the expectations of the town, and the fresh memories of his conversation with Lila all tangled together, pulling him in different directions. As the farmhouse came into view, its white paint glowing softly in the evening light, Ethan felt a familiar pang of dread. Tomorrow was the day he was expected to seek revenge for his brother's death. It was a duty ingrained in him by tradition, by the very blood in his veins. But now, after meeting Lila and hearing her talk of a life beyond the narrow confines of Greenfield, Ethan wasn't sure he could go through with it. He parked the truck beside the barn and sat there for a moment, the engine idling softly. The house was quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the trees. It was a silence that usually brought him comfort, but tonight it felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Finally, Ethan turned off the engine and climbed out of the truck. As he made his way to the house, he noticed a figure sitting on the porch swing, his younger sister, Grace. She was 16, with the same blue eyes as Ethan and their father, and long blonde hair that she usually kept tied back in a braid. Grace was often the quiet one, but Ethan knew that she saw and understood more than she let on. "Hey, Grace," Ethan said as he climbed the steps to the porch, trying to sound casual. Grace looked up from the book she was reading, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Hey, Ethan. You're back later than usual." Ethan nodded, sitting down beside her on the swing. The old wood creaked softly as it swayed back and forth. "Yeah, I had some things to take care of in town." Grace closed her book, marking her place with a folded corner. She studied her brother's face, her expression thoughtful. "You look like something's bothering you." Ethan sighed, leaning back against the swing. He knew Grace was the only person he could talk to about what he was feeling. She had always been the one who understood him best, even when no one else did. "It's about tomorrow," he began, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do it, Grace." Grace's eyes softened with concern. "You mean you don't want to go through with the revenge?" Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the fading light in the distance. "I've been thinking a lot, especially after today. I met someone in Westwood, this girl, Lila. She's been traveling, seeing the world, living a life that's so different from ours. She made me realize that maybe there's more out there than just this feud, more than just carrying on a cycle of hate." Grace listened intently, her heart aching for her brother. She had long been weary of the violence that had plagued their family, and she knew how much Ethan had struggled with it. "Ethan, I've been thinking the same thing for a while now," she admitted quietly. "I hate what this feud has done to us, to our family. It's taken so much, and I don't want it to take you to—" Ethan turned to look at Grace, surprised by her words. "You really feel that way?" Grace nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I do, and I think you're the only one who can change things. Dad's too set in his ways, and Mom's too scared to go against him. But you, Ethan, you've always been different. You've always had the courage to question things, to see beyond what's right in front of you." Ethan felt a surge of emotion at his sister's words. It was as if she had given voice to all the doubts and hopes that had been swirling in his mind. "I want to try, Grace. I want to find a way to end this without more bloodshed, but I don't know if it's possible." Grace reached out and took Ethan's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "It is possible, Ethan, but it's going to take a lot of courage, more than it takes to fight. It takes courage to walk away, to stand up and say enough is enough." Ethan squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her support. "I've made up my mind," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Tomorrow I'm going to confront Matthew Clark, but I'm not going to fight him. I'm going to try to talk to him, to make him see that this feud isn't worth any more lives." Grace's eyes widened with a mix of hope and fear. "Ethan, that's dangerous. What if he doesn't want to talk? What if he just—" "I know," Ethan interrupted gently. "I know the risks, but it's the only way I can live with myself. I can't keep going down this path. I have to try to find another way." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled her brother into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered. "No matter what happens, you're doing the right thing." Ethan held his sister close, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in days, the heavy weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't sure what would happen tomorrow, but he knew that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to break the cycle of violence that had consumed his family for so long. As night fell, Ethan retreated to his room, the quiet of the farmhouse enveloping him. He sat by the window staring out at the darkened fields, his thoughts racing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver light over the landscape. And in that stillness, Ethan found the clarity he had been searching for. He knew that tomorrow would be the most difficult day of his life. He would be facing Matthew Clark, a man who had every reason to hate him, every reason to want revenge. But Ethan was determined to try to reach him, to appeal to whatever humanity might still remain beneath the layers of anger and pain. Ethan's mind drifted back to Lila, to the way she had spoken about life and freedom, about the possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. He wondered what she would think of his plan, whether she would believe in the same hope he was clinging to. Somehow he felt that she would. As he finally climbed into bed, Ethan knew that sleep would not come easily. His thoughts were too full, his heart too restless. But despite the fear and uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of calm. He had made his decision, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the challenge of a lifetime. But as Ethan drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in his mind, a thought that gave him strength and courage as the darkness closed in around him. There is always another way. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as Ethan made his way to the secluded field where the meeting was to take place. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-kissed grass and the faint whisper of the wind. It was a peaceful morning, one that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. Today would be a day of reckoning, a day that could either end the feud or plunge their families deeper into the abyss of violence. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the field, his footsteps heavy with the weight of what was to come. He could see the silhouettes of the two families in the distance, standing on opposite sides of the field, like opposing armies preparing for battle. The Harrisons, his family, were clustered together, their faces grim and resolute. On the other side, the Clarks stood in a tight formation, their expressions hardened by years of bitterness and loss. In the center of the field, a lone figure stood waiting, Matthew Clark. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture tense as he stared across the field at Ethan. Matthew was the eldest son of the Clark family, and like Ethan, he carried the heavy burden of his family's expectations. But unlike Ethan, Matthew seemed fully committed to the path of vengeance, his eyes cold and unforgiving. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew he had to do. He could feel the weight of his family's gaze on him, could sense the tension radiating from the Clarks. This was it, the moment of truth. He reached down to his side where the handle of his hunting knife rested, a weapon that had been passed down through generations of Harrisons. But instead of drawing it, Ethan did something that shocked everyone present. He slowly, deliberately unbuckled the knife from his belt and let it fall to the ground. The sound of the blade hitting the earth was startling in the quiet morning air, a sharp contrast to the tension that had gripped the field. For a moment, there was nothing but silence as both families stared at Ethan in disbelief. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he watched Ethan's actions, suspicion and confusion warring in his expression. "What are you doing, Harrison?" he called out, his voice hard. Ethan took a step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to end this, Matthew," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't want any more bloodshed. I don't want to fight you." Matthew's jaw tightened, his hand hovering over the handle of his own knife. "You think you can just walk away from this? After everything that's happened?" Ethan shook his head, taking another step forward. "No, I don't think it's that simple. But I know that if we keep going down this path, it'll never end. More people will die, more families will suffer. I don't want that. And deep down, I don't think you do either." Matthew's hand clenched around the hilt of his knife, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Ethan's, searching for any sign of weakness. "You think you know what I want?" he spat, his voice laced with bitterness. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I know you lost your brother, just like I lost mine. I know you've carried that pain with you every day, just like I have. But this feud, it's not worth losing anyone else. It's not worth losing who we are." For a moment, it seemed like Matthew might strike, his body coiled with tension, ready to spring. The families on either side of the field tensed, their hands on their weapons, waiting for the inevitable clash. But then something shifted in Matthew's expression. Just a flicker, but enough for Ethan to see. Ethan took one more step forward, closing the distance between them. "We don't have to do this, Matthew. We can choose a different path. We can end this here, today. It's not too late." Matthew's breath came in ragged gasps as he wrestled with the conflicting emotions inside him. The hatred, the anger, the loyalty to his family. They all screamed for him to finish what had been started generations ago. But there was something else, something quieter, that spoke of exhaustion, of a desire for peace. The two men stood face to face, the weight of their families' histories pressing down on them like a storm cloud ready to burst. Time seemed to stretch out, the silence between them thick and heavy, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Matthew's grip on his knife loosened. He looked down at the ground, his expression conflicted. "What if I can't let it go?" he muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan reached out, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of understanding. "You're not alone in this, Matthew. We can find a way to move forward. Together." Matthew's eyes met Ethan's, and for the first time there was no anger in them, only a deep, weary sadness. He took a step back, letting go of his knife, which fell to the ground with a soft thud. The sound seemed to echo across the field, a signal that the tide had turned. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious, fragile sense of hope. The families, who had been on the brink of another violent clash, watched in a stunned silence as the two young men, once enemies, now something closer to allies, stood side by side. Ethan turned to face his family, then the Clarks. "It's over," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "No more fighting, no more bloodshed. We're done." There was a long pause as the weight of his words sank in. The Harrisons looked to John, who stood with a grim expression, his eyes locked on his son. For a moment it seemed like he might object, might push for the feud to continue. But then he nodded, a slow, reluctant acknowledgement of the truth Ethan had spoken. On the other side of the field, the Clarks looked to their patriarch, an older man with deep-set eyes and a weathered face. He studied Matthew for a long time before finally nodding in agreement. The decision had been made. The feud, which had cast a long shadow over both families for generations, was finally over. As the families began to disperse, some murmuring amongst themselves, others walking away in silence, Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had found a way to end the violence, to break the cycle that had consumed so many lives. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would still be scars, still be pain, but it was a start. Ethan glanced up at the horizon, where the first rays of the morning sun were breaking through the clouds, casting the world in a soft golden light. He had made his choice, and now he could begin to imagine a future free from the burdens of the past. As he turned to leave, he saw Lila standing at the edge of the field, watching him with a soft smile. He hadn't expected to see her, but her presence felt right, like a sign that he was on the right path. Ethan walked over to her, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You were right," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "There's always more to life. I just had to find the courage to see it." Lila's smile widened, and she reached out to take his hand. Together they stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the horizon, where the sun was now fully risen, bathing the world in warmth and light. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope. He had chosen a different path, one that led beyond the horizon to a life that was finally his own.